Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the fifth and final day of the Super United Rapid and Blitz Chess Tournament, which is taking place in Zagreb, Croatia. Now, yesterday we saw the five-time world champion Magnus Carlsen storm back to overtake the field and lead after the first day of the Blitz. So, in the first game of the second day, Magnus would make a relatively boring draw against Anish Giri, and we're going to pick it up in the second game of the day, or the 11th game of the Blitz tournament, with Magnus playing with the black pieces against Alireza Firouzja. Now, our recaps for this event have focused mostly on a handful of players, and we have not really spoken about Alireza. Now, Alireza is someone who had a rather lackluster performance in the rapid portion. He finished in 8th place of the rapid part of this event. Wasn't anything to write home about. Nonetheless, he is a very formidable player in the quicker time formats. So Alireza trying to get off to a good start in the Blitz. He had a relatively decent day yesterday, and let's start with the action. So second game of the day, Magnus has the black pieces, Alireza with the white pieces, battle of the generations, and off we go. So the game starts out with the move e4. Magnus plays move e5, we get knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and now we get the move knight f6. Here we have the move d3, and now Magnus plays the move bishop to e7. Now this, of course, is the classic Gucci piano variation. After e4 and e5, white develops a bishop, but Magnus plays the move bishop e7. Now bishop e7 is a move that has come into vogue very recently. I've played it many times. Many other top players have started playing it. The traditional move here is this move bishop to c5, but nowadays all moves are playable. So we get bishop e7, castles, knight c3, and now we have the move d6. Now the one drawback to the bishop being on e7 in this position is that the pawn structure is closed and this bishop doesn't have scope. Whereas this white bishop on c4 targets this diagonal for free. So sometimes you would argue it would be better if you could put the bishop on c5 and then play d6, as the bishop is on the same diagonal as this light square bishop. However, one of the advantages here is that if the bishop's on c5, white can always play a move like bishop g5, trying to pin the knight on f6. So back to the game. We got d6 here. Now bishop g5 is simply not an effective idea, as the bishop on e7 stops any pins on the diagonal. So we get a4 from Alireza. Magnus plays move a5, and now we get rook e1, and here we have the move bishop to e6. Alireza plays knight to d5, and now we get pawn to h6. Now Magnus cannot trade the knights on d5 here, because if you trade the knights on d5, all of a sudden it's spaghetti time, as you will lose the knight or the bishop due to the fork. So we get the move h6. Alireza plays c3, and now we get the move rook e8, and here we have queen b3. Magnus goes rook to b8, trying to guard the pawn on b7, and now we get the move pawn to h3. Here Magnus plays bishop to f8, and now we get the move bishop e3. Now at this point, we've basically reached the solid middle game phase here, where white has finished the development. You have the bishop, the queen, the bishop. White wants to go rook d1, and at this point Magnus has to make a decision, because there's this jumbo pony on d5 that's a big thorn in the black side. It hits the pawn on c7, the knight can always trade for the knight on f6, and you have to figure out what you're doing. Additionally, this is a blitz game, so you don't have the same situation where you can think for 10-15 minutes. You just have to go with your instinct. So Magnus trades the bishop for the knight, and now he plays knight to e7, and here we get the move bishop a7. Magnus plays rook a8, and now we get queen takes pawn, and here we have the move queen to c8. Alireza trades the queens, drops the bishop back so it can't be captured, and now Magnus takes the pawn on d5. Now at this point, when I look at this, I would think white should be a little bit better here. White has the two bishops, we're in an endgame, but the computer actually thinks that black is slightly not better, I should say, but the black has no issues here, simply because of the pawn structure. Now I don't really understand why this should be fine, but basically because the structure is so solid and there are no targets for the bishops effectively, computer thinks it's acceptable. So we get the move bishop to d2. Now Magnus plays knight b6, we get bishop b3, and here we have the move c5 being played. Now what Magnus is trying to do here is he's trying to get a bit of a grip over the central squares here. If white were able to play d4, for example, g6, d4, takes, all the diagonals are opening. There's also an open e-file here, and this knight is very well placed on d4 to boot. So Magnus goes c5 here, trying to stop white from being able to play d4. Now if white were to go c4, for example, here, trying to close the center down completely, this would be a little bit of a mistake, because now black can try to reroute this knight to c6, and you have squares on d4, b4, because all the pawns are placed perfectly. So Alireza goes d4 anyway. Alireza, I think here, trying to create some play, trying to open up the position, but as you can tell from the valuation bar, this move is simply a big mistake. Now after d4 we get takes, and now Magnus correctly plays the move pawn to e4, attacking the knight on f3. We get knight to h4, and now Magnus plays knight to c4. Computer, not a big fan of this move. I don't really blame Magnus for playing it. Apparently rook to b8 is slightly preferable, with the idea of moving the knight away so you can attack the bishop and the pawn here. But again, it's a blitz game, not a big deal. We get knight c4, and now Alireza plays bishop c3, and here we get the move g6, stopping this knight from jumping back towards the center of the board. Now if Magnus were to go g6 right away, this would be a serious blunder, because white can simply take the juicer and black cannot recapture due to the pin. So we get knight c4, bishop c3, g6, Alireza plays g3, and now Magnus plays the move knight to d5. Now this is an excellent move from Magnus, showing great understanding, because the logical move, to me at least as a human, right off is to play this move d5, trying to consolidate your big black center here. But after d5, knight to g2, the white knight is jumping back towards the center, and this pawn on d5 is a serious weakness. So we get knight d5. Alireza plays rook c1 here. If you were to take the juicer, there's knight takes bishop, and then knight d2, forking the rook and the bishop and winning some material. So we get the move rook c1. Magnus plays rook b8, we get bishop to a2, we get knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, and now we get the move d5. Now Magnus has played a masterful middle game here, because white has this pony that's out on the rim, it's not active. White has lost the bishop pair, and now the pawn on b2 is weak. There's bishop b4 threatening to win one of the rooks, and at this point it's very, very tough to play. And this just shows how good Magnus is, because if you'd shown me this position back here, just right at the start of this right here, I would have said if Alireza is playing with white against Magnus, no chance that he can end up worse, let alone be in serious danger of losing the game. So after d5 we get the move rook to e2, and now Magnus plays bishop to g7, fianchettoing the bishop and targeting the pawn on d4. We get bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, takes, and now we get the move rook d2. Now again, this is a blitz game, so you can't be super critical of the moves, but the computer did prefer pawn takes bishop here, because after rook takes e4 and rook b2, with the weak pawns on d4 and potentially a4 combined with this rook behind this passed pawn, black is apparently winning. So we get takes. Now here Alireza should have taken on e4, because after rook takes b2 you have rook e8 check, king h7, and now after knight to f3 it looks really, really scary, like this pawn is getting through. But after rook c8, c2, and king g2, white will simply go knight to e1 on the next turn, winning the pawn on c2 and salvaging the game. Again, very easy from a distance, not playing and not having to deal with the time constraints, but it is worth pointing out. So we get rook d2 instead. Magnus goes rook b3, we get knight g2, and now we get this nice move rook to d3, offering the trade of the rooks. Alireza plays rook c2. He cannot trade the towers here, because after c takes d3 the p is simply going down the board too quickly. If white plays d5, you simply take the pawn on b2, and after king f1, let's just say f5 for example, black has this connect 4 here in the center of the board. You're going to be able to push the pawns up eventually, and with your king coming over to cut off this pawn, white will lose every time. So Alireza goes rook c2. We get bishop takes d4, king f1, and now Magnus plays this move f5. Now what's really shocking to me about this move f5 is that when you look at the time situation here, Magnus has 27 seconds. Alireza has 5 seconds. He's up 22 seconds, but it's very tricky, because when you reach moments like this and you're playing with an increment, you have to sort of on the fly make a decision. Do I spend time and think, or do I just move very quickly on instinct? Now Magnus here uses this time, but he makes a big mistake. Now it speaks to intuition, how as you get a little bit older you do start to lose a little bit of that feel, because Magnus should have actually played a move like rook to f3 here, or the move c3. Now it's understandable why Magnus didn't go c3, because after takes, and knight e3, probably figured the pawn is on the opposite color of the bishop here, and white knight can jump, and maybe it's not super clean to win. So he goes f5. And here Alireza takes, we get the move rook d2, and now inexplicably Alireza makes a epic fail with the move knight f4. Now I've said in many recaps and videos in general that Alireza is very clearly the best player in the world with 2 or 3 seconds on the clock, where he has to make the move in the 1 second to avoid losing on time. But shockingly here, he falls prey to the Magnus effect. Now in this position, if Guccireza had played the move knight to e3, stopping the threat towards the pawn on f2, white is actually saving the game here. The reason for that is if black were to take the pawn on b2, after rook c5, bishop d4, and rook takes a5, we have the same number of pawns on the board here. The game will go on for quite a bit. Doesn't mean that you can't go for a swindle or find a way to win, but objectively it is equal. And if you were to take on e3, after takes, rook b2 and rook c5, rook b3, king f2, white is going to win this pawn at a5, and now we're in a rook and pawn endgame where it's going to be 4 pawns apiece, and white should never be in danger. Instead, Guccireza plays knight f4, and now Magnus correctly takes the pawn on f2 with the bishop, not rook takes f2, because after king to e1, bishop e3, and knight takes g6, black is still maybe a little bit better here, but white has great chances to survive. So we get bishop takes f2. Now we have g4 being played by Guccireza. Magnus plays bishop g3. We get knight e2, and now we have the move bishop d6. Now here, Guccireza is unable to win this pawn on the edge. He's unable to really push the p, because if you ever go b4, I simply take the pawn. So it's white being unable to push the p on the queen side, and black having 2 connected pass pawns in the middle of the board. This is simply GG, why not? We get the move pawn takes knight d4, Magnus plays e3 here, and now we get the move knight e2. Now if Guccireza were to take on f5, there's rook f2 check hitting the king. King's got to go. You take the horse, and it's over instantly. So we get knight e2. Magnus now plays f4 here. Guccireza goes rook c3. Again, if knight takes pawn, same issue. Check, rook takes f4. You're up a piece, and you win as well. So Guccireza goes rook c3. Magnus plays f3 here, simply attacking the horse. We get rook takes pawn, pawn takes knight, and after rook takes rook, or rook takes pawn, rook takes rook in this position, Guccireza Firouzja resigns, because after king takes e2, black will simply go bishop b4, and even though white has 2 pawns here, there's nothing white can do, meaning that it simply becomes a game on the king side, and eventually black is going to be able to win this pawn on h3. White can never get the pawns going over here. Black pushes the pawn, creates a queen, and it will lead to checkmate. So after rook takes e2, Magnus gets a very, very nice win in the second round of the day. This helps consolidate his advantage and lead overall in the tournament. So after this draw against Guccireza, Magnus would become Mr. Solid. He would draw his next 3 games. Now, luckily, because Magnus got off to such a torching start yesterday in this Blitz portion, he still maintains a 3-point lead in spite of all the draws. So now we are going to move to the 5th game of the day, or the 15th round of the Blitz tournament. And in this game, Magnus Carlsen, after the 3 draws, is playing with the black pieces against Nodirbek Abdu Satorov. So we get the move e4. Magnus plays c5, knight f3, knight c6, and now we get the move d4. Magnus trades, we get knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight b5, and now we have the move d6. Now this is the classic Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian. It's one of these old systems from 30 to 40 years ago that sort of was in vogue for a period in the 1990s, fell out of favor, I would say, in the 2000s or late 2000s, but in the recent times, it has become objectively the most solid setup in the Sicilian. Usually when you know your opponent's going to play a Sveshnikov, it's so solid that most players play the move bishop b5, trying to go into the Rossolimo variation instead. But Nodirbek is not afraid, and now we get the move bishop e2, and here Magnus plays a6. Now bishop e2 is a very unusual move here. I have seen it before, but it's not considered to be particularly testing. The main moves for white here are bishop to g5, which has been the main line forever, or this newer move knight to d5, which was featured very prominently in the 2018 World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. Instead, we get bishop e2. Magnus plays a6, we get knight a3, and now we have the move bishop e6. Nodirbek plays knight c4, we get knight d4, bishop d3, and now we have the move bishop e7. Nodirbek castles, and now we get the move knight e3. And here what white is trying to argue is that white can play for the central square on d5 with these knights combined with the pawn. Now this structure is very similar to another structure that can occur in the Najdorf specifically, where after d6, d4 takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6, you get something like bishop d3, e5, knight e2, and at some moment later on, white will try to play something like knight to d5, and you have the same pawn structure. Now, the only reason that I mention that specifically is because pawn structures are very important in the game of chess, and the more pawn structures you're familiar with, the better you will be in terms of making decisions when you don't know the automatic moves and you're outside of your theory base. So back to the game. We got this move knight e3, Magnus plays rook c8, and now we get the move knight to d5. Here we get takes, e4, and now we have the move bishop takes pawn. Magnus takes, we get queen d4, and at this point something has gone terribly wrong for Magnus. He is simply down one pawn in this situation. So we get the move knight to c5. Nodirbek plays knight to f5 here, attacking the bishop and the pawn, but also threatening the classic checkmate with queen takes g7. We get the move bishop to f6. Nodirbek plays queen f4, and now Magnus plays rook to e8. Here, Nodirbek takes the pawn, and Magnus goes knight to e4. We get takes, and now the move knight to e3. Now, Nodirbek has played a picture-perfect game here. Magnus is trying to create complications, but as you can tell, we're in an endgame where Magnus is down 2 pawns here. There's no real threat here, and as long as Nodirbek doesn't do something crazy or fall victim to the classic Magnus effect, he is going to win this game. So we get the move b5. Now, c3 is played by Nodirbek, and here we get the move a5. Nodirbek plays a4, and we get the move b4. Magnus desperately trying to open up this diagonal for the b and potentially create a kebab on the second rank if he can get something like this with the rook and the bishop being super active. So we get takes. Nodirbek plays a5 here, trying to push his p and use the wide peepos to end the game as quickly as possible. Magnus plays knight c5, and now we get the move bishop d2. Magnus plays bishop takes pawn, we get rook b1, and now we have the move knight d3. Now what's amazing about this is that Nodirbek has been winning this entire time, but he has made some slight mistakes. And in this position, if Magnus were to play the move bishop c3 after takes, rook c1, and rook a8, it's still probably winning for white after this move knight c4, but there are some chances for a miracle, because if white drops either of these pawns here, it's going to lead to an endgame, which will be a draw. So we get rook b1, and Magnus here plays move knight d3, and now Nodirbek correctly takes the pawn on b4, and at this point Magnus is simply cooked. Now with no counterplay, no pawns on the queen side, if you take and go into this endgame, for example, this one is simply losing after takes. Let's say rook c6 and rook a1. White has the rook behind the pawn here, the other rook on the open file, and there's just no way to survive. So here we get rook to a8 instead. We get rook to a1, and now we have the move rook a7. Nodirbek plays rook to b7 here, offering the trade of the towers, and now we get the move rook a8. Now, I did want to point out one other thing here, which is if white were to take on d5, this would be a very inaccurate order. I realized that I forgot to mention that, because after takes, if you play the move a6, there's rook to a5 here, and white cannot put a rook behind the pawn. And if you go rook b6, now after rook to a8, rook b1, and g6 here, white is simply going to have to take a draw. If you check, we trade. Now there's an ice skater checkmate with rook a1 here, so you have to move a pawn. You lose the pawn, game ends instantly. And additionally, if after rook a5, not a6, sorry, if here white were to play the move rook to a1, black can sack the rook with rook takes pawn, because again, takes leads to the same checkmate. Now, if white were to play the move rook to a2 here, by the way, after rook to a8 and a6 here, black goes to rook a7, and after rook a1 and rook d6 here, the big difference between this position and the other variation is that white's rooks are stuck guarding this pawn, meaning that black draws very easily here, because the rook always cuts the king off from crossing the file here, and both rooks are targeting the pawn. So if white ever moves off, you lose the pawn. If you move here, I can just wait forever, because the king cannot cross to guard this pawn due to the great placement of this rook on d6. So that's why this is so important that a6 is played, because now white's getting a rook behind the pawn, but the rook on the b file is always going to be active. So we get rook a8, rook a1, rook a7. Nodirbek plays rook b7, and now we got to move rook a8. If Magnus were to trade the rooks here, it's just GG, because after g6, rook a8, rooks come off the board, white gets the queen, nothing you can do. Additionally, if you were to play rook a8 after a7, this rook gets tied to the back rank. So if you ever move the rook, I have this check. And so with the rook tied, now white actually will try to bring the king closer. And at the right moment, white probably can go rook c1, creating the classic double stack on the 7th. With the two rooks here, white will bring the king up to guard the pawn, and this is simply going to be a very easy conversion to a win. So Magnus plays rook a8. We get takes, king f2, king f8, king f3, king e7, and now we get to move king e4. Magnus goes king d6, we get g4, king c6, and we get the move king f5. Magnus plays king c7, and here we get the move e4. Now, the reason a rook behind a pass pawn is so powerful is that when you look at this position, black can never bring the rook into the game. If you try to move the rook away, white will simply go a7 here, and after takes, king e5 and king d6, the king is going to come up to e7, gobble all these pawns, and the game ends. So when you get a rook behind a passed pawn, this rook just cannot become active. If black could magically get a position like this, for example, where the king is in front of the pawn, there are still some chances to maybe survive, but you're never going to get that because the moment you move the rook away, white will push the pawn, forcing a winning king and pawn endgame. So we get e4, king b8 is played by Magnus. Now we get to move rook to b1. Magnus goes king e8, trying to move the rook and have the king in front of this pawn. Nodirbek plays rook b6. We get rook d7, and now we get to move e5. Magnus goes rook d2. We get to move rook to b7 here, and at this point the rook is targeting all the pawns on the 7th rank. Is a perfect kebab, and Magnus could already resign. So we get to move rook to f2. Nodirbek plays king e4, Magnus plays g5, and now we get to move h3, simply guarding the pawn, but also avoiding the pawn being hanging on this h2 square. h6 is played, we get rook b6, Magnus checks, we get king d4, check, king e3, rook a2, and now Nodirbek takes the pawn on h6. Magnus plays king a7, we get king to e4, rook to f2, and here Nodirbek plays the very nasty move rook to f6, offering the trade of the towers. If Magnus trades the towers here and takes on a6, there are many ways to win, but cleanest is simply to go forward, take the pawn, and now you just push this p all the way through. Pawn gets just far enough up the board so the king can't get over, and that ends the game. So you can't really trade the rooks, and if you move the rook to say h2 after rook f7, king a6, many ways for white to win, but cleanest is just to push the p here, push the p further, and after rook h1, you just bring this king further, guard the pawn, and then you're going to create a queen and win the game. So after the move rook to f6, Magnus Carlsen has to resign this game. A very tough loss, his first loss, I might add, in the Blitz portion after a great run so far. With this loss, that means that his lead is now cut to 2 points with only 4 games remaining. Nonetheless, Magnus would go on to win the tournament after a couple of draws and a very nice finish with a win in the final round over the local hero Ivan Sarge. So Magnus wins the tournament by 2.5 points ahead of the second place finisher Wesley So, but we are of course going to be covering one final game, and that game features the current world chess champion Gukesh Dommaraju from India. Now, Gukesh had a very good rapid event. He actually was just amazing and out of this world, but in the Blitz, he struggled yesterday with 1.5 points out of 9. Nonetheless, he's still fighting, and let's take a look at his game against Fabiano Caruana once again today. Now, as you might recall, Gukesh beat Fabiano in the rapid. He also beat him yesterday in the Blitz. So can Gukesh go 3 for 3 and beat Fabiano every single time? Well, let's find out. So the game starts with e4. Fabiano plays c5, we get knight to f3, and now we have the move knight to c6. After knight to c6 is played, we get bishop to b5, as I just mentioned in the previous game. Of course, nobody wants to face the Sveshnikov. So Gukesh plays bishop b5, we get the move e6 from Fabiano, we get castles, knight e7, and now we get the move rook e1. Fabi plays h6, and this move is a little bit unusual. Now, when Fabiano plays the move h6, this is a multi-pronged purpose move. First idea that black has potentially is that at the right moment, black can play for g5 and g4 to harass this knight on f3 and start pushing pawns on the king side to attack. Additionally, if white plays a move like d4 in the long run, his pawn on h6 might serve a very useful purpose as it stops white from playing bishop to g5. So we get h6. Gukesh plays c3 here, angling to build the classic big white center. We get the move a6, and now we have the move bishop to f1. Fabi plays d5, we get takes, and now we get the move d4. After d4, we get the move knight to f6, and now Gukesh plays the move bishop to e3. Fabiano plays knight d5 back, we get bishop c1, and now we have the move bishop e7. Now, Fabiano here could have played the move knight to f6, asking Gukesh what he was going to do. Would Gukesh make a repetition with bishop e3, or would he try to play on in this position? Instead, Fabiano decides himself to avoid the draw by going bishop to e7, and now we get the move pawn takes pawn. Fabi takes, we get the move c4, knight f6, and now the move queen takes queen, king takes queen, and knight to c3. Now, this might look very balanced and equal, but there is actually a slight advantage here for white, and primarily that is due to the lack of scope for this dark square, this black light squared bishop on c8. It doesn't have easy access to diagonals. If black could get a position like this, for example, let's disregard that the pawn is hanging. If the bishop were able to become active on this diagonal, black would be okay. Additionally, if black could get in something like b6, bishop b7, and then king c7 and some rook d8 here with the rook on the open file and both the bishops on these diagonals, black again has reasonable chances. So in this position, we get to move bishop to d7 from Fabi. Gukesh plays bishop f4, and now we get to move g5. Here we get bishop g3, and Fabiano plays knight to h5, trying to get rid of this dark square bishop, which is kind of preventing black from easily developing the king here. So we get bishop to e5. Fabi takes, and now we get to move bishop to e8, and here Gukesh plays knight to e4. Fabi goes bishop to e7, we get c5 being played, and now the position is starting to turn in Gukesh's favor, primarily because of these knights in the center. If white is able to get this knight to d6 here, look at these knights. They're so well placed here, targeting the pawn on f7, the bishop on e8. If black ever trades, you have this great passed pawn here, this great knight that's perfectly placed, and black is in a world of hurt. So we get the move king c7 from Fabi, trying to stop knight d6, and now Gukesh plays rook e to d1, again intending to put this knight on d6. Fabi plays f6, we get knight to c4. Now these knights both are gripping towards the d6 square, as well as this potential b6 square as well. So after knight to c4, we get to move bishop to c6. Here Gukesh plays knight to d6, and now we get to move rook a d8. Gukesh plays b4 here, and Fabi plays bishop a4, and now we get to move rook to e1. Now you'll notice the bar suddenly spiked, and the reason for that is that after rook to e1 is played here, this bishop is doing nothing on a4. On c6, it is a well-positioned bishop. Obviously, Fabiano was worried that if he were to play just some random moves like rook h7 and a4, white starts pushing the p on the queen side, and the king and the bishop are very, very uncomfortable here, but there were better options. So we get rook e1. Now Fabi plays knight g7 here, and as you probably will have noticed, the reason the bar is spiked is if black pushes the pawn to avoid hanging the pawn here on e6, there's knight to f7, forking the two rooks, white wins material, and the game ends instantly. Now if black were to move the rook to say d7, after rook takes e6, knight f4, and rook to e1 here, white is simply up a pawn. There's an open e file. These knights are very, very well placed here, and the result is not in doubt. So Fabi goes knight g7. Gukesh plays knight f7, forking the rooks. Fabi plays rook f8, and now we get knight takes rook on d8. Here Fabi captures, we get knight to b6, bishop to e8, and now the great move bishop c4, putting even more pressure on this pawn on e6 with the rook and the bishop. Now if black ever goes e5, knight to d5 will be catastrophic here, because after king d7 and rook d1, everything is hanging here. The king is on an open file, the bishop and the knight are super well placed here, and black's position is just falling apart immediately. So Fabi plays rook to d4, desperately hoping for a miracle, but this is simply a blunder. We get bishop takes pawn here, and now if Fabi plays rook b4, there's knight d5, forking the bishop, the king, and the rook. You move the king, you lose the rook. You're just down 2 towers here. 2 towers is way too much. So Fabi goes bishop c6. Here Gukesh plays bishop to d5, a nice move intending to take the bishop on e7 and creating the classic kebab on the 7th rank. We get to move bishop to d8. Gukesh plays rook d1. We get knight to f5, and now we get bishop takes bishop, king takes bishop, and here Gukesh plays rook e6 check. Fabi goes king b5, we get rook takes rook, knight takes rook, and now we get to move rook to d6, attacking both the bishop and the knight at the same time. Fabi plays knight c6, trying to guard the bishop on d8. Now we get knight to d5 here, even though white doesn't have an immediate way to win the game. With all these weak pawns, on top of the fact that white simply is up a rook for a bishop, there is no chance to survive. We get to move f5, Gukesh plays rook to d7, king c4, we get a3 being played, and now Fabi goes a5. Gukesh plays knight e3, we get king b5, rook takes pawn, king a4, and Gukesh plays move b5. Here, Gukesh is pushing his 2p up the board here. Black's just completely lost. Fabi plays knight d4, we get rook d7, attacking the knight and the bishop, bishop f6, and now after b6, Fabiano simply throws in the towel and resigns. This b pawn is going up the board, the p is coming, white is going to create a queen, and black has just no hope at all. So a very, very nice victory for Gukesh. He goes 3 out of 3 against Fabiano. He beats him in all 3 games in this Grand Chess Tour event. A phenomenal performance. Honestly, these 3 games, I'm not sure that I really felt like Fabiano had great chances at all. I mean, he got crushed in the classical game. which we recapped. The Blitz game yesterday, he had some chances, but overall, Gukesh was vastly superior in these 3 games. Now, it's funny because when I say that, a lot of people going to this event would have said Fabiano is simply a much better Blitz and Rapid player than Gukesh. But as I said in another recap, Gukesh is very strong. He has a lot of time, and we don't know how high his peak is going to be. So, with this victory, along with a couple of other good results towards the end of the day, Gukesh was able to climb and finish in 3rd place, which frankly, after yesterday's Blitz performance, I think is very, very impressive, honestly. I was worried he would finish in 4th or 5th place. He was very close to finishing 2nd place. In fact, he would have most likely finished 2nd place had Fabiano not made an epic fail in the final round against Wesley So to lose at the last second in a game which Fabiano should have won. Had Fabiano won the game against Wesley, Gukesh would have gotten clear 2nd place, but nonetheless a very, very good performance from the young Indian world champion, and I am really excited to see how he progresses in Blitz and Rapid in the coming years. So, Magnus gets the big win overall. Not a huge surprise after yesterday. A good, solid performance from Gukesh. I'm waiting to see who's the next victim to say that he's presumably the weakest player in the field. Maybe in the next Grand Chess Tour Rapid and Blitz in St. Louis if he's competing. But at any rate, it's great to see his performance. It's great to see that he didn't let yesterday's terrible result get to him. And it's just going to be really exciting to watch the future of Indian chess. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 5th and final day of the Super United Rapid and Blitz Chess Tournament, which is part of the Grand Chess Tour and being held in Zagreb, Croatia. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with some more great recaps and other content very, very soon, especially with the upcoming freestyle tournament in Las Vegas next week. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll see you very soon. See you. Bye.